Thank you so much for that introduction, Laura. Yes, I'm Queen of the Vampires. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to have you here this evening on this very auspicious occasion as we celebrate the paperback publication of 21st-Century Gothic and Edinburgh Companion. It is my pleasure and delight to be joined by several contributors from the volume this evening, and of course the co-editors Xavi Aldana Reyes and Maisha Wester. I have a very light touch on the chairing tonight, but just a couple of housekeeping announcements. Obviously, as Laura has said, please do keep your camera off and your mic off if you're not contributing, apart from the panelists, of course, and please try and keep the mics off if you're not speaking. We do have a chat running, so if you have any burning questions, please do put them in the chat and we will organise or invite you to ask your question in due course. We'll have 30 minutes at the end to have various discussions about the contents therein. We also have a 30% discount code as well, which I will put into the chat for you to purchase the paperback copy of the book. You can buy that exclusively from Edinburgh University Press's online shop. It's not available anywhere else. And the book will be dispatched to you as soon as it is made available, I think towards the end of this month, as far as I'm aware. So to briefly kind of go over the events tonight, as I said, please do keep the recording mics and everything to a minimum. We want to make sure we can hear everybody. As you know, this event is being recorded, so if you don't want to be seen or heard, please just keep the camera and the mic off. The paperback codes, which I will put into the chat, is NEW30, that's NEW30, or PAPER30, PAPER 30. Now, this is my part where I'm going to start being quiet and introduce the fantastic editors of the collection. We are joined by Maisha Wester and Xavi Aldana Reyes. Sorry, Xavi, please wave for the camera. And we also have we're joined tonight by our panelists who will be introducing separately. But just so we have them here tonight, if you don't have your camera on, please do. We've got Dr. Sarah Eilert. We have Dr. Joseph Crawford. Please do wave. Dr. Murray Leader, Dr. Rebecca Duncan, Dr. Anya His von der Lippe, I'm always sorry if I say that wrong, and Dr. Enrique Ayura Ibarra from Mexico. We are going to be introducing people in order in due course, but I'm going to start with the co-editors of the collection. In the audience, we also should have, I should say, apologies, we should have a couple of colleagues, if you are there, Kazia Okunta from out in Asia. We have Professor Gina Whisker, I hope, Claire Nally, or Sam George. So if you're in the audience, please do put on your camera and wave. They have been talking that they would hope to join us this evening. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our editors, beginning with Maisha Wester. So Maisha Wester has several accomplishments, but one of which I'm going to read here essentially, which is that she's an associate professor at Indiana University and author of African American Gothic Screams from Shadow Places. She was a 2017 to 2018 Fulbright Scholar at the University of Sheffield, where she is currently on a global professorship scholarship. And her chapter in the book dealt specifically with Black diasporic Gothic literature and socio-political deployment of Gothic tropes in racial discourses. So welcome Maisha as the first of our co-editors. Maisha, would you like to start? And then I will introduce Xavier when we're bringing him into the discussion. Would you like to start?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Sarka, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. Thank you, BAFTA, for hosting this celebration of the release of the paperback version of the book. I thought I'd start off by saying a few things about what some of the aims of the book were and what we're hoping to achieve with it. So, like the first manifestations of the Gothic genre, we're looking at the Gothic at a point similar to its first appearance. At the turn of the 21st century, it's a time of major socio-political and technological change and debate around the globe. So if you recall, on the edge of 2000, we were still really worried about Y2K, if you remember that, anxiety. We were and continue to be concerned about security of our data, as well as breaches in privacy that have been enabled by advances in technology. We were concerned about the rise of terrorism and terrorist activity in numerous locations, and yet another US-led war, which former President Bush tried to make a global initiative. And of course, there were the waves of contagion from Ebola to bird and swine flu, if you remember when swine flu was the major concern of the day. Oh, the good old days. And so what we're seeing then is another time of severe concern and anxiety that produced a phenomenal amount of work. And so what was also important in thinking about the changes to the Gothic in the 21st century was to acknowledge the way technological advancements have enhanced globalization and global connectivity. And thus, we're also thinking about the ways in which the genre has extended well beyond its original Eurocentric literary origins and has developed even beyond the Western manifestations we saw in the 19th and 20th century. Now, also important to this text are the ways that globalization and ethnicity are appearing in the 21st century. Now, Ethnogothic has been around well before the 21st century, but it's been the subject of new scholarship and attention, in part because it has achieved greater resonance in light of various socio-political shifts that we're all aware of, such as, for instance, Black Lives Matter and the increased assaults on African Americans in the US. But there's also, occurring alongside that, in rising debates on immigration and national borders that were of concern, not just to us in the text as scholars, but also of global concern, alongside rises in nationalism and white nationalist movements, right? So these increased anxieties, which assume particularly ethnic and racial aspects, also led to greater attention and greater productivity of the Ethnogothic. Greater access to new technology also meant marginalized populations could really create Gothic texts in new ways and distribute them in new and ingenious ways, right? So expanding internet access meant newer and growing Gothic communities, such as what we see, for instance, in the two-sentence horror stories online. Filming became more accessible thanks to changing technology, right? We all technically have a filming device on us in the form of our phones, right? And so we're seeing more minority created films, both in large scale in terms of actual film productions, studio productions, such as what we see in terms of Guillermo del Toro, but also small scale in terms of brief short films, right? Films that could be the length of anywhere from a TikTok video to a 5-minute film short. And thus this access by non-Western, non-white populations means there's quite a bit more text to analyze. And these texts assume really disparate and diverse forms. So we're not just looking at literature anymore, right? We're looking at film like J-horror and Korea horror films. We're also looking at internet manifestations, which Joseph Crawford's chapter speaks to quite wonderfully, in which we also see in the works of authors such as Catherine Altrin's essay on the Aboriginal Gothic, which also looks at internet manifestations as well as other media manifestations of Aboriginal Gothic. And so really, this text, this volume is seeking to get a hold of these new manifestations of the Gothic at the moment of explosion, when we're seeing these manifestations appearing and responding quite immediately to new changes and shifts around the globe. So that's a bit about why, some of the information about why we were really interested in doing this collection. And I have to admit, the rise of the Ethnogothic and its centrality to this collection was really one of the things that I was most interested in myself, given my research on African-American Gothic. So I'll stop there and hand it over now, hand it back to Sorka and my co-editor, Zavi. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Marita. No, you're absolutely right. There are so many ways we can look at how the book has not only kind of spoken to the rise of issues that have been resurgent and come again and again within the book, but also as well speak to the transdisciplinary and transmedial nature of the Gothic as well in the 21st century. So you've encapsulated that really, really nicely. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the second editor of this volume, the second co-editor of this volume, Xavier Aldana Reyes, is reader in English and Literature and Film at Manchester Metropolitan University. And he's the author of Spanish Gothic, Horror, Film and Affect, and Body Gothic, and the editor of Horror, A Literary History. And Xavi is chief editor of the Horror Studies book series run by University of Wales Press. And in this lovely volume, which I hold in my hands, he has also written the Contemporary Zombies chapter in the collection. So without further ado, here's Xavi to tell us a little bit more about the contemporary reach of this book and how it is, why it is still important and how it speaks to our pre and post pandemic concerns. Over to you, Xavi.
Thanks, Erica. I wanted to just pause a moment to say a few thank yous before I launch into that part of the conversation. I wanted to say first and foremost thank you to Laura, Shelley, and Kate for giving us this platform to both to promote the book, its contributors, the work of it, and also, more generally to talk about the Gothic, which is something that we often do in little silos away from the horror community. So it's a great opportunity to do this together, and for being so just wonderful and welcoming and just everything. So thank you, and thanks as well to you, Serica, for running this event, and to the contributors for devoting their time and not just with their chapters, but time this evening as well to be here. By the way, I wanted to back up what you said. If there's anyone in the audience who is part of the collection who doesn't get a 5-minute slot, you'll be very welcome to come in later if you want to sort of contribute to the conversation and say hello and introduce yourselves. It was really, really difficult picking only 6 of the chapters for tonight. And as you thoroughly spotted, Sharae Deckard couldn't be with us due to a family emergency. So Rebecca Duncan kindly stepped in to cover for her. And finally, a thank you as well to the series editors, to Andy Smith and Bill Hughes, who were very, very helpful in terms of giving us direction, a sense of travel, so that this volume would be in dialogue with others in the series. As for example, your next book on 20th Century Gothic, Serica, which you're currently editing and which will come out in the same series. Right, so I think the question was around, what we've been talking about methodology and sort of and the aim of the book, and just as important as the ethnicity part of it for us was to sort of contribute to conversations around genre, conversations about what the Gothic is and what the Gothic does, because I feel that historically those have been kind of dialogues that have been had around trying to first of all pin down what the Gothic is so that we can talk about what the Gothic does. And I think that if this collection does anything, is continue that conversation. And we certainly didn't start it. We need to acknowledge the influence of critics like Catherine Spooner in particular, whose work on the contemporary Gothic has been, I know, hugely influential, not just to myself, but other people in this panel. And we were delighted to have Catherine as part of the collection as well. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here tonight either, but her work on Gothic comedy has very much shaped, how we see the Gothic today. And for those of you who are interested in this collection, we would also recommend Catherine's own Post-Millennial Gothic, which came out a couple of years ago, I think, 2017. Time goes by quicker than you think. So without that work and the work of critics like Fred Botting, Gina Whisker, many other people who have theorized the contemporary Gothic, we would not have this collection. So methodologically, it speaks to that desire to connect the Gothic to aesthetics, to connect the Gothic to literary aesthetics in particular, and to connect it to cultural work, and hence the work of colleagues like Lenny Blake, who is in the collection as well, and very much uses the Gothic to talk about the present. So, you were talking about pandemics. Yes, the chapter, my chapter on zombies is, half of it is about pandemics. Little could I foresee when I was writing this chapter that only a year later, all hell would break loose. But it was very clear to me when I was writing that chapter on zombies, and the work came actually from working closely with a microbiologist, a colleague, Joe Varan, who runs this group on microbiology and literatures of infection. So that was the thinking behind that. It's probably now more important than ever, but that goes some way towards showing us how narratives often anticipate. They're not just symptomatic of the time, but they also anticipate greater catastrophes. The pragmatic side of the volume was much more prosaic, and as you know, Sirica, we run a unit called Post-Millennial Gothic in our master's program in MA English Studies, the Gothic, and we wanted secondary research for that unit, and we found that it's not that there isn't any research on any of these areas, of course there is, but it was always very precise. It was either based around one book, or it wasn't transnational enough, or it wasn't transmedia enough. So one of the drives for us was certainly to create that book, a book that we could put together alongside the concerns of that unit, which have to do with all of the things that Maisha has mentioned now: technology, nationality, class, gender, all of these issues that I feel we're all talking about all of the time in the humanities, and that I feel the Gothic naturally contributes to. So that's what we were trying to do with the book. And the reason we divided it across 4 sections, we felt those 4 sections, monstrosity, critical concerns of the Gothic, subgenres, and then the Ethnogothic, were the 4 pillars of where the Gothic is today, speaking back to the Gothic tradition intertextually to say things about the present, continuing to develop the conversation around monstrosity and alterity, and then looking into how new technologies emerge. And this is where the work of someone like Joe, for example, and the work that he's been doing with technologies of the Gothic and Gothic technologies, so to speak, both of them have come in quite well. Some of the emphasis of this evening is specifically on the ethno part of the collection, and that's because we think that it has received little notice, and it's a big part of what Maisha and I wanted to do. So Sarah, for example, and Rebecca will be speaking to that aspect of the collection. I will shut up now and pass the baton on to my colleagues, and I'll be happy to contribute to the conversation, to the questions later. So thank you.
Thank you, Xavi. That was fantastic. I'm going to introduce some of the contributors now in order in which they appear in the book. So I'm going to start with my own colleague at Manchester Met, Sarah Eilert. And Sarah is Senior Lecturer in English at Manchester Metropolitan University, and her chapter in the book, which I did have a note of here, her chapter in the book deals exclusively with post-colonial Gothic and its reach, of course. And Sarah has, I'd like to actually invite Sarah to expand on this further, but she has been selected by the Schomburg Centre, and I would like to expand on this great honour for her chapter, if you wouldn't mind. And Sarah, would you mind elaborating on this, and of course on the global culture and the socio-political concerns, of course, of your chapter? Have you frozen on us? Oh dear. Sarah, oh yeah, I think we've caught up with you.
Hi, apologies. It keeps cutting out. So if this, can you give me a nod if you can hear me at the moment? And I can just see if, yeah, great. Sorry, my internet is terrible. So if it does cut out, I will hotspot my phone and come back that way. But yeah, thank you so much for the invitation tonight, and also for the invitation to join the collection in the first place. It was a really good way of kind of consolidating my thinking and research that I've been doing over the previous period of years, and a really good opportunity to kind of put it all together. I think before I lost the connection for a sec, you were talking about the Schomburg Centre's work, Sirica. Yeah, so I think basically the Schomburg Centre works to curate texts that are related to an international discourse around anti-racism and racial discrimination. And they put together a Black Liberation reading list that features literary works from poetry, novels, memoir, etc. That are designed to foster a greater understanding of Black experiences. And for 2021, they've identified, I think, over 2,000 journal articles and book chapters that discuss these primary sources and made them freely available. through an online catalogue. So if you've got friends without institutional access, recommend it definitely. There's a lot of great stuff out there for free that you can download and keep as PDFs. So in terms of this chapter, I was just reading back through it today because I've had a child and a global pandemic since I wrote it, so I've forgotten everything, but it's reminded me how much the things that I was thinking about then are still so kind of horribly pertinent. Yeah, so it's great to be here. It's I do miss the kind of the experience of being all together and drinking shit wine, but there's the added possibility in the case of my context here that one of the kids will come in fancy dress. So there's a possibility of some added excitement there. So in terms of the chapter that I wrote for Maisha and Savi's collection, I discussed post-colonial Gothic basically as the ideal means of registering colonial violence and critiquing imperialist discourse. So the act of making monstrous or of representing people as other than or less than human is central to colonial and racialized violence. And Gothic literature is always engaged with this in some sense, this kind of monstrous discourse, either fueling it, as in the case of Imperial Gothic, or exposing and challenging it, as in post-colonial Gothic. So what I was trying to do with this chapter is kind of think about this kind of, I guess, subgenre of post-colonial literature that's been emerging since the middle of the 20th century at least, and thinking about kind of how it's addressing new concerns in the 21st century whilst kind of maintaining an engagement with the kind of original acts of colonial violence. So what I'm doing at the outset is kind of identifying some of these continuities, but then also thinking about the shift from 20th century concerns with more epistemic violence that's related to structures of knowledge and repressed histories, and thinking about the kind of the colonial history returning at this period of history, to a more materialist turn in 21st century post-colonial Gothic that's thinking about systemic and ongoing violence in the contemporary post-colonial world. So this concern to address the ongoing nature of colonialism seems more relevant than ever at the moment, in its most literal sense, in the context of things like the ongoing colonization of Palestine, or to address its kind of ongoing aftermath through imperatives like decolonizing the curriculum, through addressing things like the systemic racism of the Metropolitan Police, to challenge the Islamophobia of the Conservative Party, just to take a few kind of examples from recent British politics alone. So its relevance is still kind of really apparent, I think. So in the chapter, I talked about some of the new directions that 21st century post-colonial Gothic has taken. In particular, I looked at its allegorical engagement with the politics of the border that register this hardening of nationalisms that we've been witnessing for at least the last 20 years or so. So I guess when I wrote the chapter in 2018, I had no idea how much worse things were going to get in many senses. But the continuing relevance of a genre that's able to engage in nuanced ways with the politics of the border is kind of still very apparent. I also talked about how the genre has evolved to address the unequal environmental collapse that have roots in the combined legacies of capitalism and colonialism, using the Gothic to engage with history, economic, political and ecological violence of colonialism to resound into the future, calling for a renewed critical engagement with the past and reparations in the present in order to change the course of history, iteration of post-colonial Gothic. Another way that 21st century post-colonial Gothic evolved has been to address phobia particularly. And once again, this is a monster that keeps raising its head. Only yesterday, a report in the UK tried to convince us that Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party are not systemically racist, as systemically Islamophobic, though some individuals may have been offended by marks that led directly to a 375% increase in reports of Islamophobic hate crime. So you can see the kind of the conflict that's going on in the discourse there. That the Gothic is kind of well equipped to address. So in terms of new directions the chapter has identified, I ended by considering the Sukoyant, this kind of syncretic Caribbean monster as a kind of newly repurposed monster for the new millennium, and thought about its use in contemporary fiction. So where critics like Jennifer Lorne have talked about the ghost in relation to post-colonial Gothic in really powerful ways, and I was arguing that the ghost is tied to one locality. So it speaks to a particular place and particular kind of localized or national concerns. Whereas the Soucouyant was born of the Middle Passage, it was born of the kind of the combination of European and West African mythologies. It's a migrating monster, it moves from body to body. It possesses its victims, but it's also itself victimized. So I was trying to argue that it's the perfect monster really for registering the kind of systemic and networked violence of the global present, particularly in relation to post-colonial societies. So in the act of writing the chapter, I came across and was kind of quite influenced by Michael Lowy's concept of critical irrealism, which I think of as a way of engaging with and representing reality when realism fails, like the language of realism fails. So this critical irrealism is a key feature, I would suggest, of contemporary post-colonial Gothic, because it offers a means of re-engaging with the absurdities of contemporary post-colonial or neo-imperial societies. It kind of registers the horrors that realist discourse fails to represent, or at least to make heard in a way that kind of people have access to or people can hear. And I think that this is where the real potential of Gothic literature and culture to address the ills of contemporary society lies, I think, and why it's important to keep tracking these developments in 21st century post-colonial Gothic. So I'll be happy to kind of carry this on in the discussion later, but thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you, Sarah, that's great. I particularly also wanted to congratulate you on that, because I think it's such an interesting and such an important time for that collection to come out as well, in terms of you know, the range and diversity that we need to actually look at these critical writings really seriously and reconsider them, obviously, in light of global politics in the last few years. So it's really important. So thank you for that. On to our next speaker. Joseph Crawford, senior lecturer in the University of Exeter, whose chapter, which was quite frightening and awesome, Gothic digital technologies in the collection. Joseph, would you like to tell us about your thinking about the digital future and the terror of the digital present?
Yes, I mean, Gothic digital narratives has been very much on my mind over the last year and a half, as we've been in this very weird, spooky situation of engaging with this kind of ongoing horror story that plays out, I think, for most of us primarily via computer screens. I mean, you know, I'm a teacher and researcher, but I'm also very heavily involved in student support. And I have been in the unenviable situation of just listening essentially while student after student tells me essentially pandemic horror stories, but never in person, always mediated via Microsoft Teams as a sort of narrative that plays out over the internet. So it has felt frequently like I am in a sort of unpleasantly lengthy digital horror narrative of my own this last couple of years. But in relation to the chapter, I have two interests in Gothic, really. I started off working on Romantic era Gothic, late 18th, early 19th century literature. But I'm also very interested in popular Gothic fiction of the 21st century, particularly in its kind of lowest status manifestations, in its least canonical forms. And that's partly because those are the ones where I feel the kind of sheer disreputableness of original Gothic literature most lives on. Because when Gothic started, when Gothic originated, as Meisha suggested, in fact, in her opening talk, it was in a moment that had a lot of parallels with the present. And one of the ways in which it had this parallel was that the original Gothic works were taking advantage of new media technologies and new forms of media distribution, like the popular novel, like the penny serial, which gave us the Penny Dreadful and the Penny Blood, like the popular melodrama, to produce kind of new forms of hybrid literary works that were accessible to new audiences and new voices, in particular voices of women, who formed such a crucial constituent amongst both the writers and audiences of those sort of first two generations of Gothic literature. And a lot of the controversy over this original wave of Gothic literature was precisely because it was in these new hybrid forms that didn't have a stable place in the kind of established formal and generic hierarchies of the literary culture of the day. And that was thus seen as kind of inherently monstrous. Today, of course, a lot of this stuff has been absorbed into the canon. You know, in the 18th century, there was seen as something slightly horrible about novel reading. You know, parents got very anxious if they saw their children reading novels, whereas today it's something the parents boast about. Oh, my child is reading novels already. But what we do see today is a playing out of essentially exactly the same anxieties that attended that original wave of Gothic fiction, but applied now to our new media technologies, to things like computer games, to things like viral videos and stories propagating via social media and crowdsourced creepypasta and other forms, you know, that are so new that they haven't yet quite been absorbed into our existing cultural hierarchies, and that thus still preserve something of the same sense of the kind of the shock of the new that those original Gothic narratives had for their original readers. And consequently, they are kind of regarded very frequently as Gothic objects. The media discourse around these new media forms is often extremely Gothicized. People talk about the internet often as this very Gothic space, as this sort of dark labyrinth of these sort of horrible lurking monsters hiding in the depths. And people are always anxious, much more anxious about the kind of corruptive capabilities of new media than they are about old and established media forms. And so what I found really interesting about looking at digital Gothic technologies is the way that very frequently they kind of are in dialogue with these moral panics and draw upon this sense of the digital as itself a kind of Gothic realm, as a realm characterized by corruption, by surveillance, by infection. You know, the metaphor of the virus is very, very common. Either as computer viruses or the idea of a mimetic virus that can infect your mind if you expose yourself to the wrong kind of stimuli. And of course, as well as drawing on the kind of new formal possibilities of this new media to kind of disorient and disturb viewers in new ways that wouldn't have been possible in older media forms. The new distribution mechanisms enabled by the internet, exactly as Meisha suggested earlier, have opened up Gothic media production to huge new groups of creators and made it accessible to huge new audiences. So digital Gothic is global Gothic. It draws in people from all around the world. In particular, it has established these very strong kind of cultural dialogues between Europe and North America on one hand, and East Asia on the other hand. But every continent contributes to it. And also it's provided, especially in recent years, space for this kind of extraordinary flourishing of queer digital Gothic narratives in forms like visual novels, where there's been an absolute explosion of queer digital Gothic storytelling, which often draws upon the kind of formal possibilities opened up by digital sort of non-linear narratives to queer the narrative itself. So it's been really, but my chapter in the book is already out of date because it's a field that moves so fast. It's my attempt to kind of track the history of Gothic from its earliest manifestations in Usenet horror fiction back in the 1990s, via online urban legends, viral found footage videos, creepypasta, crowdsourced horror mythology like the SCP Foundation, and on into kind of social media fiction. But the field moves so fast that it's, as I say, it's always the most rewarding thing about studying it is the chance to see it reacting in real time to new developments in technology and new trends in the world. So I found it really rewarding to study, hopefully illuminating to being able to write about it in a way that's made it accessible and to people. And also, not least, I think it's probably made me, or given me a better appreciation of what it would have been like in the late 18th century to be reading Gothic fiction for the first time, back when it was still this really just new, disreputable, marginal form, just like digital Gothic media is today.
Thank you so much for that, Joseph. I think it's really interesting, as you say, like it's simultaneously sort of in date and out of date. There's something sort of continuously sort of present and absent about it as well. I think it's something that I like, that tension. I think it's really interesting. So I'm sure we're going to have some questions about that as well, and especially the advent of the new and the digital horror of teams and all of these things that we've had to confront. So thank you for that. Next, I'm going to introduce Murray Leader, who is joining us from University of Manitoba. Murray is writing about something I know he truly loves, close to his heart. He's writing about contemporary ghosts in the collection. So Murray, please, delighted to have you with us, and if you wouldn't mind, tell us a bit about your chapter and why it's still relevant.
Yeah, no problem. And if you're Queen of the Vampires, am I King of Ghosts or something like that?
No problem. We'll split up.
Does that sound cool or not? I can't really tell. So thanks very much, and I'd like to thank the editors very much for having invited me. And I always, perhaps it's productive to acknowledge that I always feel a little bit like an imposter in these settings, because I don't really think of myself as much as of a Gothicist. That's a hard word to say out loud somehow. Easier to type. And in that, while a horror scholar per se, I mean, I always feel a little bit like when I get published in a venue with Gothic in the title, I'm like, do I even know what the Gothic is? I don't know if anybody were to ask me that I could give like a concise answer to that. So this was actually useful for flexing my muscles a little bit in that direction. Because as much as I dwelled on ghosts, I don't know that the word Gothic even appears in my book, except for in passing here and there. So I wrote my dissertation on early cinema and ghosts, or the supernatural, and that became the book, The Modern Supernatural and the Beginnings of Cinema. And of course, I tried to be very, very strict in limiting myself to early cinema, treating the beginnings of cinema as the end of something. The end of a century or so of like supernatural media. But of course, it's not the end. It's just that end was outside of my field of view for the purposes of that project. So this was kind of useful for bringing it up to date, for like vaulting over a century and talking about the extent to which many of the same kinds of issues, the same kind of tensions are with us today. So the idea of the ghost as being something very associated with technology, something that's very associated with media, the extent to which modern spiritualism was kind of a bastard offshoot of new technologies, notably the telegraph, the idea of instantaneous long distance communication, which has these spectral implications, and the photograph, and so on. There wasn't a technology that wasn't claimed by the spiritualist movement in some way or another, and that includes cinema, and that's something I'm still kind of grappling with right now. So forward a century, and I note that maybe the only horror icon to have emerged around the beginning of the 21st century is the girl from The Ring, Sadako or Samara, a figure of the breaching of media worlds and the phenomenal world around them. And her influence just reverberates in all of these ways, and also kind of establishes, through the success of the remake of The Ring, the ghost film as a kind of viable form of middle-brow horror, which for a while was Blumhouse Pictures' bread and butter. Through The Conjuring. Well, Conjuring actually isn't Blumhouse, but this style of horror film, which also very much has a lot to do with anxieties about real estate, because they sort of come around in wake of the housing crisis and so on, and a lot of them are about the tensions of ownership, what one can own and what one does with that space, and whether you master that space, and so on. But likewise, there is an interesting kind of nostalgia for analog media And that's one thing that I found that sort of comes off of The Ring too, but we have like films like White Noise, which is about radio waves. It's a 2000 film, which is all about analog technology, and then films like Sinister and The Canal, and these are films about film, but very specifically about vanished modes of films like 8mm and 16mm, and which are interested in the archive and interested in sort of what the past teaches us about the present, and how things that happen in the past shape the present as it turns out. And I guess it comes down to like, that's what interests me about The Ghost, in that it's always current and obsolete at the same time. That it always has a footing in multiple periods, because ghost stories are narratives of renewal, that something happened in the past and now it's happening again. And what do we know that can help us deal with that fact? And there are many other things, and many of them make it into this chapter in some form. But I was really struck, and something that I put sort of in my conclusion, by how many 21st century ghost texts rely on a kind of indeterminacy about who actually is a ghost. So we have lots of narratives in which it's just not clear to the audience, to characters, if so-and-so is a ghost or not. And we have lots of situations, and I think the digital is behind this on some sort of level, where characters penetrate a ghost world, like happens in the Insidious films. And that there's this alternate world, which is the same but a little different, hovering around us all the time. And characters sort of go in and go out of that world, or end up, as happens at the end of Mirrors, occupying another world that looks exactly like this one, except for everything's different on some sort of fundamental level. And you know, the academic currency of the ghost is signaled by this spectral turn, which was inaugurated by the arrival of Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx in the early 90s. And I keep on kind of asking myself, like, is it over? Is that thing over now? And the answer always seems to be no, that our sustained interest in spectrality has not gone away. Like, I assume that if it's a turn, we have to turn away from it at some point. But that doesn't seem to have happened yet. And yes, indeed, real hauntings never end. They persist. And what is different is just how interested and just how obsessed we are with these hauntings at this particular moment in time. And I guess I have to end by saying, long live the ghost.
Thank you, Murray. My goodness, yes, I think we are hauntologically haunted, aren't we? We are just somewhere between all the kind of horrors of the past, the tensions of the present, and of course the lost analog past and the horror of the tentacular digital future. Somewhere in all of that, we are ghosts. I think we remain ghosts. I wanted to introduce Anja Heise van der Lippe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, as someone who has an unpronounceable name of my own. I'm just worried. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced it, so please correct me. I'm sorry for my European lack. And I was going to say, you are joining us, of course, from where to go from? Sorry, the Institute of English Languages and Literatures at the University of Tübingen, Germany. Thank you for joining us. And you are going to talk about the post-human Gothic.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sorka. And,
apologies.
No, I'm actually not in Tübingen at the moment.
Oh,
I've been stuck in Berlin in lockdown for over a year now, so it's actually fantastic to be able to join you. And I just wanted to say that as someone who kind of lives in a Gothic diaspora in a way, because there are not that many people doing Gothic in Germany, or at least not at my institution. It's really great to be able to be at international events for a change. So just saying, Zoom also has kind of a few advantages for those of us living a bit farther away from stuff. So first of all, thanks Maisha and Xavi for putting together such a fantastic collection, and for inviting me to talk about my chapter today. I wanted to briefly connect to a few things that other people have said already. So this idea of the sort of technologies emerging, or not emerging, but becoming much more important at the beginning of the 21st century. This is something that also drove my chapter, but it basically rests on the premise that both the Gothic and critical posthumanist theory are interested in questioning something that is much older, and that is the rationality and the dominant role of the fairly exclusive concept of human personhood that came out of Enlightenment humanism. So the Gothic, on the one hand, has done so by exploring the limits of the rational and by focusing on the numinous or the supernatural, but it's also from the beginning, as some of you have pointed out, a genre for exploration, for marginalized writers, a testing ground for literary experiments, for the exploration of genre conventions, and frequently also for the exploration of kind of deviations from the cultural conceptions of the human. So Frankenstein, for instance, is the key text for me in that respect, because it questions very early on what it actually means to be human. And I don't think it's a coincidence that so much of Frankenstein criticism kind of, you know, gets its teeth in that idea and tries to tease out those post-human tendencies that we have very much before the post-human even emerges in the novel. So on the other hand, critical post-humanist theory often focuses on what it means to be human in a world that is becoming increasingly post-human, and specifically on how humanity's involvement with all of those brilliant new emerging technologies has made it necessary to rethink what it means to be human. And where these explorations are based in feminist critical thought, for instance, they often also specifically engage with the exclusiveness of the concept of the human. So if you think of people like Donna Haraway or Rosie Braidotti, for instance, they argue that not all of us have historically been considered human, or that we're still not all of us are considered fully human all of the time in all the places in the world. So in the sense that we have political representation, or that we have universal human rights, right? So this continues to be a question that needs to be asked, and posthumanist theory argues that we need to reconsider those humanist paradigms, and that we are specifically need to consider those paradigms where they continue to exclude people based on, for instance, gendered or racialized or other omissions and exclusions. And here too, one could of course think of a number of Gothic texts that engage with these omissions and oppressions, and there are many connections to be made to the other chapters in the volume, and I've already heard some of those from the other presenters tonight. But for instance, human-animal hybrids, there are a lot of those in the volume, the undead or other forms of Gothic liminality. So for me, the Gothic and critical posthumanism basically ask very similar questions, but they explore them from different angles. So I find it particularly interesting to see where these intersect in texts that use Gothic aesthetics to explore post-humanist questions. And those are the texts I try to engage with in the chapter. And the examples I looked at, for instance, 2 episodes from Black Mirror, the television series, explore post-human Gothic fears of what humans might become based on how we currently connect to and are immersed in various post-human technologies. So for instance, surveillance or genetics or various forms of medializations. And I think that was what Joseph was also talking about earlier on. So these often play out on a meta level in these texts. And that's what I find particularly interesting, when we kind of have the text also doing what it is talking about. So given the fact that these questions are not only ongoing, but they're actually becoming more and more relevant to people's everyday lives. So from jobs to housing, to healthcare, to various forms of state control or how we interact with authorities, I think these are still highly relevant, in fact. And one of the well, the series creator for Black Mirror, Charlie Brooker, has actually said in various interviews that some of the things he envisioned in the series as sort of dark dystopian things that might happen in the future have become reality over the time that the series was airing. So that's actually quite a, I think, horrific thing to happen if your dystopian nightmare series becomes reality. So these are highly relevant questions still, and especially as we still really haven't figured out what to do about them. I mean, how do we engage with these technologies, and what do we do? How do we regulate them? And in many ways, those are still ongoing questions. So what the post-human Gothic frequently does is to confront us with our subconscious fears of these developments and to allow us to think through those things as worst case scenarios. So that's what the texts also do that I talk about in my chapter. Not necessarily in a very like orderly or coordinated manner. This is not like a handbook of how to engage with dystopian technologies, but at least in the most interesting examples, I think they are critically engaging. They ask us to engage with these processes. So in any case, I think these questions are highly relevant, especially in the context of the continuous production of post-human Gothic texts, media, and so on. And my chapter was attempting at the time was to kind of bring the Gothic and post-humanist theory together, to give a few examples of where such explorations are already being done in fictional texts, and to sort of raise those questions for further explorations. And I think what the collection does quite brilliantly from the other chapters I've also looked at is to sort of present overview texts, right? To not just focus on one reading of one text, but to show all of those connections between different texts. And on rereading my chapter today, for today, basically, I remembered that I had also written about the graphic novel series, The Beauty, which engages with different forms of virality, so medial virality, but also in sort of viral, infectious virality. And little did we know at the time, obviously, but I think this is another tangent that we sort of need to continue to explore, and where I think we have many connections in this specific collection. So these non-human aspects of the virus, I think that's also something that I engage with in my further research, and I'm currently taking to a project on climate change. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Anya. That sounds like a really interesting upcoming project as well. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I'm not rushing anybody, but I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So I just want to introduce Rebecca Duncan with us this evening. Thank you, Rebecca. Rebecca is postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Languages at Linnaeus University in Sweden. And Rebecca's chapter was on the postcolonial, it was on South African Gothic, excuse me. It was on South African Gothic in the collection. Are you there, Rebecca?
I am here. I'm very happy to be here. So I'll just start quickly by saying thank you so much to Xavi and Circa for inviting me to talk to you this evening about my chapter. I'm also just really thrilled to have been part of such a rich and necessary collection. So as Circa said, my chapter for the book was called South African Gothic, and it draws on research that I did for my own book, which was called South African Gothic, which was published in 2018. And in that book, I kind of made this argument that Gothic vocabularies in South African cultural production over the fall of apartheid, so the kind of long transition from apartheid to democracy, those Gothic vocabularies kind of map shifting sites of anxiety that emerge in South African kind of socio-political and socio-economic configuration as the apartheid state collapsed. Collapsed, fell, and then democracy proceeded. And to make that argument, I drew on kind of world systems related Gothic analyses which kind of make similar arguments, but just on a much kind of bigger, more global scale. So I was kind of taking this paradigm and telescoping it down for the South African context. And so the chapter that I wrote for this book engages with that argument that Gothic kind of maps these shifting sites of anxiety. It engages with that argument at the point of the 21st century. So in South African cultural production that is developing sort of around the second, usually sort of around the second decade of the new millennium. And the thing that I was interested specifically in the chapter was the emergence of horror as a kind of signal, the signal mode in which Gothic was being written in South African fiction. And that was interesting for all sorts of ways. One of them being that horror has not been particularly prevalent in South African fiction. But another reason that was interesting, and this actually relates also to Sarah's chapter in the book, is really that the kinds of horror fiction that were being written in the South African post-colony sort of resist interpretation through the kinds of the established theoretical paradigms that we have for thinking about Gothic in post-colonial contexts. So we tend to think about post-colonial Gothic as a kind of literary language of haunting, in which the kind of the traumas of the colonial past resurface and they trouble the post-colonial present. And this is also interesting, actually, in relation to what Murray was saying about the kind of persistence of spectrality and the ghost, because what's interesting about this shift that I was looking at in the South African post-colony is that the rubric of Gothic in this fiction was sort of almost resolutely not spectral. So we're talking about really very, very material and bodily vocabularies of horror. And so I sort of started from the point of thinking I need to find a new way of thinking about how to frame these fictions and how to describe this aesthetic, and also how to analyze, as Abby was saying earlier, what it's doing. And to do that, I looked in the chapter in kind of two critical directions. So I looked in the first instance to also work related to Michael Lurvey's idea of critical irrealism. So I looked to world literary interpretations of the Gothic, particularly as they are advanced by the Warwick Research Collective and kind of affiliated scholars on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I looked to anthropological debates around the emergence of occult discourses in South African popular imaginaries. So these are occult discourses which draw on indigenous African cosmologies and belief systems, and they tend to kind of deal in the currency of figures of the undead, but also in narratives or kind of anxieties about organ harvesting, about witchcraft, and these kinds of practices. So I kind of tried to bring these two fields together to think about how can we think about this horror vocabulary that is emerging in South Africa after the turn of the millennium. And sort of from that kind of theoretical combination, we kind of get to the analysis that, or to make the point that what these Gothic figures are doing is not really registering an anxiety about a colonial past, but registering or in fact actually trying to make visible and encoding forms of violence which are very much still ongoing. And what are those forms of violence? I mean, it's potentially sort of unsurprising, but the way to kind of interpret where that violence comes from and so on, we kind of need to look at economic shifts which take place around the same time as the fall of apartheid, which kind of takes us into the domain of thinking about neoliberal capitalism, how neoliberal capitalism intersects with histories that have been histories of cultivated racialized unevenness. And so essentially the argument that I was making was that Gothic figures, actually very much like occult figures in South African popular imaginaries, do this work of making visible an experience of essentially systemic and structural violence. Systemic and structural violence which kind of emerges, as I say, kind of as the neoliberal agenda overlays the form of racial capitalism that was cultivated under apartheid. And I think you can kind of see, I mean, I think we can all see how these ideas sort of, I think, continue to be relevant and speak to the present. I think in particular, you know, this combination, thinking about the relationship between colonial history on the one hand, and then emerging and kind of still active forms of capitalism on the other hand, really sort of have to be the starting point from which we begin to think about race and inequality on kind of geopolitical scales. And not least because you know, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic are specifically kind of revealing how socioeconomic inequality continues to be racialized, you know, on multiple scales, so within nations, but also kind of on these big geopolitical relationships between regions of the world. So I think, yes, I hope, yes, the ideas that I was exploring in the chapter continue to be particularly relevant. And they actually also form the kind of the foundation for work that I'm doing at the moment, attempting to think about the relationship between Gothic and horror, and not so much post-coloniality, but decoloniality and decolonization. And so, for example, in a special issue of Gothic Studies, which will come out next year, I am I'm editing the special issue. So we're thinking about, and Maisha's contributing to it. I see she's nodding. And what we're thinking about is the way that Gothic engages with coloniality rather than colonialism. So which is precisely this sense of the ways in which race and racialized inequality continue to be kind of hardwired into the power structures that organize the world. And these ideas are kind of really building and expanding on the ideas that I was thinking about from that vantage point of South Africa in the chapter.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. And last but in no ways least, of course, we are joined by Enrique Ajuria Ibarra, who is a senior assistant professor at the Universidad de las Americas Puebla in Mexico. So Enrique, I won't take any of your time up. Please do introduce yourself and tell us about your fantastic chapter, which is on Latin American Gothic.
Thank you, Sorka. I'm going to try and keep it brief because, you know, we're kind of running out of time. And thank you to the editors and to the organizers of this event for the invitation as well. I think it has been a very good presentation of different chapters because we can see all the connections between, you know, everything that we need to discuss and understand about 21st century Gothic. So Maisha and Xavier were really nice to invite me to write a chapter on Latin American Gothic. And as Anya was saying, it was much more of an overview chapter, so I found it a bit difficult to write because I needed to try to provide as many examples as I could. I think the main purpose of my chapter is precisely the recognition of Gothic in Latin America and how it has developed, particularly in the 21st century in various media, particularly film, television, and digital media. I think one of the important things to consider about the chapter is this idea of how Gothic is recognized in the Latin American region. It's still kind of marginalized because, you know, there are still ongoing debates with other concepts such as magic realism or the fantastic. So there is a clash there in trying to understand how Gothic fits into, you know, into our culture. Thank you, Maisha. I also wanted to point out that even though Gothic might be considered somehow marginal in Latin America has also recently contributed with concepts for Gothic studies such as tropical Gothic, which has already been covered by Justin Edwards and Sandra Vasconcelos' fantastic collection of essays, Tropical Gothic. It's a concept that was coined in Colombia in the 1980s to refer to stories that happen literally in the tropics, in the jungle, and talk about, you know, the idea of decay and monstrosities and the past in this tropical area. So we need to factor in other issues, environmental issues such as humidity and the heat and everything that really eats away into structures and places too. I think one of the interesting features of the chapter is how Gothic, I would have to say Gothic horror, has been used in the few examples that I address in the chapter to talk about many concerns, many current concerns in a few Latin American countries pertaining to ideas of gender and ideas of identity. The three films that I briefly explore, such as We Are What We Are, which is a Mexican film, and La Casa Muda, which is a Uruguayan film, they deal with notions and ideas of domestic violence, gender violence as well. So there has been a trend in recent years in Latin America about the idea of violence against women, femicides, etc., and how these two films address the issue of macho culture as well, particularly Latin American macho culture as monstrous. So that's something that connects, all the chapters too. And then I move on to Juan de los Muertos, or Juan of the Dead, which is the Spanish-Cuban film. And there are monsters there, it's a lot of fun. I think I can see Anya smiling. It's a great film, but I think the interesting thing about this Spanish-Cuban film is that the concept of the zombie, which is usually associated with capitalism and neoliberalism and consumerism, here it's used as a symbol of a decaying political regime, which is the specific regime that is ruling Cuba. And then I move on to talk about tropical Gothic with a Mexican TV series called Niño Santo, which I think is quite a coincidence. I was just again revising my chapter again, and one of the plot, one of the part of the plot is this group of physicians, medics who are going to an isolated town in the tropics, an isolated village, and it's part of a vaccine campaign, and the people in the village refuse to get vaccinated, and it kind of feels very appropriate for our times, with some people refusing to get vaccinated with on the current pandemic. What I find fascinating about Niño Santo is the way that it's a Mexican TV series that takes part of its inspiration from a real event of a healer in northern Mexico, which is more of a desert region, and then decides to tropicalize the event and move it to the tropics. And again, I think that's one of the key elements of the chapter and what it's trying to make us understand, that Latin American Gothic is much more, it kind of works in a sort of kind of recognition and exchange of ideas, and how these ideas are adapted or tropicalized to, as if you want to use that word, to address specific issues that are of our current social, political, and cultural concerns, and how the notions and ideas of horror and the monster are used to address these issues. The idea with Niño Santo is the tension between the local and the global, the idea of coming with modern medicine and people rejecting it because it might be dangerous, it's an invasion, etc. And again, it addresses a few of the issues that my colleagues have been talking about. And finally, I try to take a plunge into the digital domain with the Charlie Challenge. That was a very difficult thing to say, which was fun. It was very difficult. I remember Maisha and I talking about it a lot because he was trying to fit it in with everything. But what I think the point was is that in the digital domain, the idea of origins can be a bit lost. And it's this idea of embracing a story or an urban legend or a creepypasta, like Joe was saying, and actually kind of it develops into a network of popularity on the web, and then you have no idea where it comes from and how this urban legend affects your own notion of the past experience. So the idea of the Charlie Challenge, it was constructed from other media because it's based on an American film, or it's inspired from an American film called The Gallows. But then again, it kind of connects with urban legends of, you know, making connections with spirits, and we used to play that, at least in Latin America. I've played with that. So the idea of the past and where the legend comes from becomes a bit blurry. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to do, is this idea of trying to trace and map where Latin American Gothic stands. I think it fits very well with the notion of opening up, recognizing, getting all these influences and then working them with local legends, local events, and local concerns. And in this way, Gothic, once again, helps us disclose, or makes us understand or realize how certain concerns about ourselves, our notions of subjectivity and identity, and even national identity, can be questioned, can be constantly questioned with this dark or negative aesthetic, if you want to call it that way. So I'm going to stop it there, so I don't want to talk too much. That was pretty much my chapter, but thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. So we have had a couple of questions in for the panel, a couple of them pretty much asking all of you. So if you want to chip in, please do. I'm just working through them here. Just give me 1 second. So does the panel think that what is it that 21st century Gothic has come to represent? Is it a reactionary genre resurging to deal with rising or surging social concerns that we feel do not belong in or to this century? So racial, sexual, gender discrimination, classism, etc. This is then further expanded to incorporate newer social concerns, i.e. eco-criticism, technological and digital issues. Is this the redevelopment of an old platform, or are we creating a new one under an old name? So are we thinking about this as reclassifying or recategorizing or possibly rearranging older forms of disruption, I suppose, for a new century? Does anyone want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that. So I think one of the beautiful things about the Gothic is that it's constantly adapting, changing, and mutating, right? Its aesthetics, or rather I should say it's the kind of emotive response it seeks to achieve remains the same, but the method adapts, right? Because it is a highly mutable form. I think that's what makes it so effective. So in a way, it's a redevelopment, but also a creation of a new platform. The one thing I will say is that it's not necessarily, I don't think of it as a rising or a reappearance in terms of the 21st century. And I was looking for this wonderful line from New Interventions in American Gothic, in which the authors, Savoy and Martin, are talking about the pervasiveness of the Gothic in America in particular. And they say that if the Gothic may be said to be everywhere, then it coheres nowhere in particular. And while that sounds like a slight, it's also talking about the ways in which the Gothic doesn't ever really go away, right? The way it haunts and infects discourses, but in particular nations, but I think in our current stance, in the global sense as well, right? So when you ask about it responding to the ideas of, or how it reflects the sense that there are certain ideologies that should have died out a while ago, but are still around. Well, let's be realistic about the nature of the West and advanced societies in general. We're haunted by a bunch of horrible ideologies and behaviors that should have died out centuries ago, and yet nonetheless are maintained into our current moment. So the Gothic never really leaves us, right? If anything, it's a question of dominant popular society and culture starting to pay attention at particular moments, right? But the Gothic doesn't really go away. It's there, right? It just experiences a popular resurgence and manifestation at particular times. But it's always under adaptation and change. It never dies away, right? And that's the beauty of it. It's like one of Murray's ghosts, right? So Murray, in a way, you're also kind of well, one of the lords of the Gothic, as the Gothic is a ghost itself. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that, to speak to that question, Kat. Good question.
All I heard in my head was Lord of Misrule, Murray Leader. So anyway, you got a new moniker now. Thank you so much for that really succinct, really excellent answer, Maisha. Did anyone else want to contribute to that? It was quite encyclopedic. Yes, please, Anya.
Maybe just briefly, I also think it's important to look at who is writing the Gothic, and that the Gothic kind of innovates itself by sort of bringing new voices in, and by giving people who were kind of previously marginalized a go at those ideas and at those texts. So, I mean, even if we have mainstream Gothic texts that are kind of replicating the same old aesthetics and that present monsters that are kind of, I think Fred Botting makes that argument too, that are kind of presented over and over again to the point that they become so much a part of everyday life that they're no longer really monstrous. There are lots of people kind of also experimenting with Gothic ideas that didn't have a chance to do so beforehand, and I think that's the way the Gothic also keeps innovating itself as a genre. So just as a side note to what Maisha was already explaining very well. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Anya. I have another question here. Again, I think it's open to the panel, to be honest, but I'm interested in this notion of the contemporary monster, writes Emma Liggins, and wondered if any of the contributors to the monster section might want to comment on the different experience of representing or understanding monstrosity in the 21st century Gothic. How can we only understand the monstrous? How can we now, excuse me, only understand the monstrous or the ghostly in relation to film and media? Yeah, please, Murray.
I mean, I don't know if I have a definitive answer there, but it seems like something I want to chime in on, insofar as like I have an interest in spectrality studies and also in monster studies, and not that people haven't studied monsters for a long time, but it is kind of interesting that they crop up around the same time in the 90s, even if they're doing slightly different things. That like monster studies starts to cohere as a kind of discipline or sub-discipline or something similar around those times. And yeah, it definitely is the case that to a large extent our monsters have been reshaped and re-understood through media texts. Like what we think of as the vampire, that mostly comes from novels, that mostly comes from movies now. Like we're pretty far removed from the folkloric incarnation of the vampire. Would you disagree with that? The zombie even more dramatically so. The zombie being almost entirely a creation, like as most people would understand it. When I show like pre-60 zombie films to my students, they have no idea. Like the idea of the voodoo zombie and so on is like, it's just an alien concept altogether, which is kind of fascinating in itself. It's like the zombie's been whitewashed through that process. So it is the case, you know, it is the case that our media texts have reshaped our monsters, reshaped our ghosts pretty substantially. But, you know, they were always understood through discourse. They were always understood through media of a sort. I don't know that I want to preserve the folkloric as some sort of pure expression of the nature of these beings who are always subject to change. They're always subject to cultural adaptation over time in different places. But it does seem to be much more dramatically the case in the 21st century that, you know, but all the same, there's still plenty of interest in, this is why there's so many guidebooks out there about ghosts and about, there's interest in belief, there's interest in these sort of pre-medial inscription versions of these ideas, but then those get mediatized in their own right through these circuits. They circulate as nonfiction instead of fiction some of the time. I don't know if that was a great answer, but it was perhaps an answer.
Xavi, do you want to contribute to that at all? Because I know you've written the contemporary zombie chapter, and I also know that Bernice Murphy is in the audience for the serial killer one. So if anyone wants to chip in on that one.
Yes, absolutely. If there's anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak tonight, feel free to come in at any point. Yeah, I mean, part of my answer would be part of the answer I would have given to the previous question, that to assume that the Gothic is only doing this now is to forget that the Gothic has always done this, and that it has always resisted any kind of generic category, you know, that in a way that the writers who we now see as engaging in the Gothic, with some exceptions, were not always necessarily writing in a specific tradition. They were not driven by genre, they were driven by what they were trying to say, I think. And so in a way, our conceptualization of the Gothic is always necessarily a critical endeavor, you know, and I think this is why, you know, to sort of like address partly what George is raising there as well about the difference between genre and mode, I think that's also partly why we have moved towards an understanding of the Gothic as a mode rather than as something that's necessarily tied down to a form of aesthetics or thematics. Now, I don't want to suggest that that is, you know, an attempt or an approach that's not valid. I have used it in my own work purely because the Gothic has become so lax now as a term that it's a little bit like postmodernism, where it sort of attaches itself to anything and everything. And as Murray was saying, you know, what does it mean anymore? You know, how does it separate it from horror? Now, I'm not interested in offering a one label, you know, or one definition for all, but I think that, as in the case of the zombie chapter, a case of many of the chapters in the collection, what interests us really is what the Gothic is doing, and we seem to be less interested with sort of demarcating it and territorializing the Gothic in a way, you know, and hence the work of people like Rebecca, for example, sort of using that label, or Kasia in that very same collection, using that term to describe some of the cultural products in Asia, but also at the same time questioning that label. You know, to what extent does that label allow us to think about a culture that may not be using that label to define their own products? So yes, I would say that the monsters that the Gothic intertextually races have always been doing this in one form or another. You know, maybe the colonial aspect is, you know, has been left behind for very obvious reasons, because, you know, it's you know, the ideology behind that type of zombie would not be an ideology that could be sold to an audience today openly, but we now use it to talk about other things that concerns us just the same, like virology, like forms of alterity and social difference, integration, as in the case of, and assimilation as well, as many critics have been talking about, for example, in relation to the queer zombie. So I think that it's less to do with genre delimitation and more with the porous nature of a dark way of writing or filming, you know, the things that concern us. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. I'll shut up now.
That's no problem. Just to say that, again, just I'm going to put in my own 2 cents here to say the vampire, of course, has always been sort of fascinated by and in dialogue with advances in technology and understanding how they can remain, you know, up to date with a vengeance, as Jonathan Harker described Dracula himself. So there is always this sense of vampires being sort of somewhat ancient and the modern, and they're always in that contestation of that dialogue. So I think there's something very interesting about that, because even with our own contemporary vampires, What We Do in the Shadows, the television series, that kind of thing, it is about that confrontation of the ancient with the documentary style and image, and of course that being something that is mediated through getting even more interviews with even more vampires. So and, you know, it doesn't matter how close we get to them, though, we'll never fully understand the experience ourselves, regrettably. Anyway, so next question for the panel, a fascinating question, I think. Beyond external hardware, we've also learned a lot more about our internal hardware, neuroscience and the brain. Could any or all of the speakers touch on how we've learned about the brain and perhaps particularly the neuroscience of trauma and how this is showing up in the 21st century Gothic? Anyone want to venture into neuroscience on this one?
Well, I'll go ahead and take a crack at that one, because what really speaks out to me most obviously is Get Out, right? Which is entirely focused on the idea of the ways in which the brain can be, and its traumas can be displaced, right? While at the same time, I think what that film is trying to do is also argue that trauma doesn't reside utterly and isolatedly in the brain itself, right? So for instance, to say that Chris's vision, one of the ways in which his power as a photographer is from the trauma he experienced, not just as a child, but also as an African-American, that trauma has then made its way to his eyes, right? And as such, the film is locating the trauma as an entirely bodily experience, not just as within the brain itself. Even as the brain becomes a point of complete disregard and detritus when it is a minority brain, right? And so there's this way in which that film is very much playing with the notion of where trauma resides. Is it something that exists solely in one portion of the body, or is it really located elsewhere, everywhere, right? In ways which can be then appropriated more readily, right? And so again, when we think about other elements of that film, thinking about, you know, how hypersexualization is a kind of trauma which becomes more digestible once the brain which processes the trauma is gotten rid of, right? And so I think, you know, thinking about the location where trauma is seated and the ways in which the minds, the psyches of minority body populations has been historically disregarded. I think that's really one of the major fields and major concerns of Ethnogothic itself.
Fabulous answer, Maisha. Any other contributions to neuroscience of the brain? I have a lot of questions, so if not, have a think and maybe we can get back to that one because it's a really interesting one, I think. Are there any upcoming new novels, television series, film, or forms of media any of you are looking forward to seeing and how it might relate to your work on the Gothic? Anything that you've all been dying to see during the pandemic that we just haven't gotten around to, or has been completely knocked out of theatres? Or
Candyman. Everyone wants to see Candyman.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I've been waiting for 3 years for that. Like, Jordan Peele needs to stop messing around and just let the film out. That's all I'm saying.
The new Conjuring. I'm going to see it tomorrow. It's out today. The new Conjuring film. The devil made me do it.
Can I chime in and say, for those of you who haven't seen the Senegalese film Atlantique, Atlantics, it's on Netflix. But for those of you who haven't seen it, it's fantastic, and I think really actually kind of demonstrates quite a lot of the concerns that we've been raising in these kind of very related and networked ways about what Gothic is now in the 21st century and the ways it engages with kind of dynamics and structures of power that are, you know, present and current. It's fantastic, so definitely check it out.
Thank you, Rebecca. Any other recommendations, or anyone who's just absolutely dying to see something in particular?
Just to mention something. Sorry,
no, sorry. About a year ago, Edgar Wright announced a project called Studio 13 about a haunted Hollywood backlot, and it's like, yeah, that sounds up my alley. So hopefully that ends up happening, because I think I would like to see that. Absolutely, that sounds class. Xavi.
Just to mention a novel for the sake of it, I'm really looking forward to the 3rd volume in the John Ashby the Lindqvist trilogy, the X trilogy, which is coming out in November, December, I think, called I Am Tiger. And I do recommend that trilogy to anyone who hasn't read it. It is, you know, contemporary weird at its best.
Thank you, fantastic. I have a question here from Lisa to say, would the panelists speak about their recommendations for zero textbook costs texts to teach in 21st century Gothic lit courses? My understanding of that is that it's low to no cost textbooks that you'd recommend. Obviously, we would recommend you buy this textbook for 30% off with EUP. But beyond this, is there any textbooks you'd recommend? That's my understanding of your question, Lisa. If I'm incorrect, please do come on the microphone. I'm assuming I've somewhat correctly cast from the ruins. Anyone have any recommendations of any textbooks about 21st century Gothic beyond this brilliant one? Well, we did recommend at the beginning, at the top of the area, Catherine Spooner's book, of course, Post-Millennial Gothic, and there are some other fantastic textbooks we can recommend as well. We'll hang back on that one because there might be something that will come to mind. I will move on while Xavi warns me here in the chat not to say it 3 times in front of a mirror. So whatever that might be. So, but the question and recommendation was, the ring has become a staple Gothic research object. Has there been any interest on African or Southeast Asian Gothic, especially with the trailer from the Philippines made Trays on Netflix dropping on recently? So is there any other anything beyond sort of the research object and, as I say, African or Southeast Asian Gothic texts? Anyone want to speak to that at all?
Well, I mean, I can speak to African texts. I mean, the film I just mentioned a second ago, Atlantique, it's the Senegalese film. Another really interesting narrative which employs Gothic in a not necessarily, it employs elements of Gothic in a really interesting and I think also very current way is Namwali Serpel's The Old Drift, which is a fantastic kind of science fiction, horror, kind of multi-generational Zambian narrative, which kind of follows the colonization of the area around the Victoria Falls. But there has been, there is, I mean, just to speak more generally, there is a kind of burgeoning interest in Gothic, in African fiction specifically currently at the moment. And if you want to check out stuff about that, the Routledge Handbook to African Literature, the new one, has some stuff about African Gothic on a kind of critical level.
That is fantastic, thank you. Was there, I think there was a correction to that as well that was to do with beyond South African, so I think more of a Pan-African response as well. Is there any, Atlantique may speak to that? Or
yeah, neither of those texts are South African, they're both, so one is from Zambia and the other is Senegalese. But you know, Nnedi Okorafor, who and a number of other kind of quite prominent Nigerian writers of speculative fiction. There is also a journal, the name of which I have completely forgotten because I am on the spot, but I will remember and put it in the chat. It's a journal of African speculative fiction, which often features Gothic and horror and is kind of Pan-African. I'll remember that.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. We have another question here. I think Xavi alluded to an answer to it earlier on, but again, where do you talk about the transition of the Gothic from a distinct genre to a mode of perception or indeed address? And one of the points that was made is that this caused it to expand its parameters, but also potentially lose some of its specificity. I'm wondering if any of the panel may be able to reflect on this point a little more in light of the new developments that have emerged since the publication of the collection. So has anything expanded it yet further, I suppose, within your categorizations that you've been examining, and why this shift towards the Gothic as a mode is so significant in the 21st century? Does anyone want to speak to that one? It's a great question from George. Jorge. Yeah, Sarah, please.
Yeah, I'd say I think of the Gothic as a mode definitely in the way that I'm kind of using it critically and thinking through it. And I think almost it becomes a bit of a kind of toolkit, a way of kind of interrogating contemporary discourse and saying kind of how can we bring what is happening in our society at the moment to the forefront? How can we make this kind of conversation that's not quite being had? How can we bring it out and use these kind of the language of the Gothic, some of the tropes of the Gothic themes, how can we use them to express these contemporary concerns? And it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot in terms of talking about post-colonial Gothic, because I'm a bit anxious at points about kind of using this Gothic as a concept that's a kind of risen out of Western discourse and has been employed in these very kind of often violent ways in terms of discourse, about then applying that to nations, to contexts in which it hasn't been discussed as Gothic previously. And so I'm thinking in particular about, I talk a bit in my chapter about Raj Kamal Jha's novel Fireproof, an Indian novel that's kind of very much drawing on the language and techniques of the Gothic to explore the violence in 2002 in Ahmedabad and the rise of the Bharatiya Janata Party, of Hindu nationalism. So it's kind of using this Gothic language, these Gothic tropes in a very different context. But I think that's why it's helpful to think about it as a mode, as kind of a toolkit, a way of approaching a situation and bringing something to light, or talking about something in a different way that just makes it more apparent. And in the context of that novel of Fireproof, he's kind of using this as a way of kind of speaking the unspeakable in the terms of the many Muslims, or predominantly Muslims, who were killed in the context of the riots, the violence in Gujarat, and thinking about how to represent respectfully and ethically voices that haven't been given that respect, that representation in reality. So they're not imaginary voices, they're not kind of fantastical voices, but they are voices that haven't had that have been excluded from dominant discourses, and often, you know, have been physically kind of excluded through kind of brutal murders. So I think that it's useful to think about Gothic as a mode in that way, as kind of allowing a way of exploring a topic. And I think that that's what this collection speaks to so well. It's thinking about all of these kind of problems in contemporary society, basically, and thinking about what Gothic does to bring that to light, to address it in different ways.
If I might tag on to that as well, in connection to what Sarah was so wonderfully and beautifully pointing out, is thinking about the ways in which politics actually reverts to the Gothic, right? One of the ways that, you know, for instance, our thankfully now gone former President Trump got into office was by deploying the Gothic. His favorite mode of action was to deploy fear, right? In ways he talks about on the other side, you know, in terms of, you know, where Sarah's thinking about the ways in which, you know, Muslim populations deployed the Gothic, to think about the terror of that they have been suffering within this state, which is highly Islamic phobic, right? Is to think about the ways in which the Gothic has been deployed against immigrant populations and racial populations in very recent political history, right? And we might also even think about the way the Gothic has been deployed against as part of transphobia as well, right? In addition to numerous other ways, right? So really one of the reasons I think this collection is timely is because the Gothic has entered not just into the state of being deployed as mode, but because it's being deployed as a mode in very serious ways with high stakes, right? So it's important for us to really be cognizant of the ways in which the Gothic has been used historically and in our contemporary moment, to also be wary of how it's being used against us, right? Used to manipulate us to make decisions, which again, as a recent history in America has shown, make decisions which really aren't very smart, right? So yeah, that's one of the other reasons I think it's important to really think about the shift to mode form, as it were.
Thank you for that, Maisha. That's fantastic. I've got the last question of the evening, I'm afraid, but last but no means least, of course. So it's slightly tacking on to an earlier comment about whitewashing the zombie, but it is speaking, what does the panel think of mainly of American and Japanese popular media taking over the cultural roots of other cultural monsters? So thinking of Castlevania here, or the Yurei, of course, is a ghost type in the game Phasmophobia. So while they apologize for the video game references, which might be lost on some of us, I think there's a greater context that we need to talk about in terms of the colonization or the absorption of other cultural monsters within sort of those larger kind of groups of American or indeed Western understanding of monsters. I was wondering if anyone wanted to speak to that in particular. Was there anything you want to talk about in relation to breaking away perhaps from that, or does your chapter identify how it is able to kind of forge or return to its earlier identity or its cultural roots?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say actually something just really briefly, and it sort of connects to what a couple of other people said earlier in relation to the Gothic being a mode. I mean, obviously the kind of cultural appropriation of the cultural appropriation, the kind of commoditization of indigenous cultures is it's a deleterious practice, right? It's not great. I think though that there is something interesting to be said about thinking about how indigenous kind of, you know, I mean, it's difficult to, I don't want to kind of blanket, you know, I don't want to blanket everybody outside of the West. However, non-Western or non-Enlightenment rooted cosmologies produce monsters. I think it is interesting to think about how those monsters relate to this thing that we're calling Gothic now, because I think that there is something interesting. There are these, the question is kind of pointing to this sort of tension around what is and isn't okay to call Gothic. And this is really an important, and it's an issue that we need to sort of be cognizant of. However, there is also a sense in which that kind of line of thinking leads to this sort of strangely racialized gatekeeping around what is and isn't Gothic. And I think I think we are at a point where it may be interesting to think kind of Gothic from to think the situation the other way around, to think about what is it that that folkloric or non-Western occult forms can tell us about the Gothic. So instead of saying, do these things count as Gothic? It might be more interesting to say, how can we rethink the Gothic so that the Gothic is able to account for anxiety that doesn't just emerge in this, you know, in one cultural space. So I think those questions around appropriation and so on are really interesting, but I think they're interesting specifically because they're leading us into this more difficult and complex territory, which actually has got to do with, I mean, really the sort of theoretical inheritance that we use when we think about, you know, Gothic as a mode or as a genre or whatever it is. Yes, again, sorry, a little bit rambly, but I do think that it is a very interesting kind of and rich question to ask for all of those reasons.
That's a fantastic answer, Rebecca, because I'm thinking of it in terms of actually switching it from the subjectivity as well, the idea of not rather of those who get to call something else Gothic, but rather from those who have been Gothicized to interrogate and question those who hold the power and have cast them out as other or cast them in a racialized or, you know, as I say, othered or expunged fashion. So I think there's something fascinating about that inversion of power and space and subjectivity. Joseph, you wanted to speak and you've been very reserved, so we'd love to have something.
Oh, yeah. So I mean, I just come off what Rebecca was saying there actually, and coming back to the question which cited Castlevania, which is of course a Japanese franchise drawing on European folklore remediated through American kind of horror cinema, in which sense it's very characteristic actually of a lot of especially kind of contemporary digital forms of Gothic media. I mean, computer games are a very good example here, because I think it's now pretty clear that some of the most influential works of 21st century Gothic fiction in terms of kind of cultural penetration are things like Resident Evil and Bloodborne and Dark Souls, all of which are Japanese reimaginings of Western Gothic horror material. Dark Souls is a particularly fascinating example here, insofar as it kind of reroutes Western Gothic imagery through sort of Buddhist and Taoist influence, sort of sense of spirituality, and then remarkets it back to a Western audience. And one thing that I find very striking about a lot of the digital Gothic media that I look at is it's very, very, very self-consciously hybrid in its cultural forms, right? That, you know, that you will find, say, a Russian AMV mashup of you know, Japanese series based on European folklore. You know, so they will bounce around a lot, and that can have a very you know, that has a negative side, insofar as, you know, things that are rooted in specific cultural context can just kind of get fed into the blender and all come out as this sort of generically Gothicized, internationalized product. But it can also produce as these moments where the periphery writes back, exactly as Rebecca's suggesting, where peoples and where cultures who have previously been viewed primarily through the lens of Gothic monstrosity as the monsters offer their own perspective on the well, often on the imperial centre as the truly Gothic zone.
Thank you for that, Joseph. It's absolutely bang on, I think, and it's really, really interesting that you've we've returned to that great idea again, that idea of contesting the boundaries between the centre and the marginal and the subjective. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I would like you to please join me in thanking all of our contributors tonight, the panelists and our co-editors. And anyone in the audience, if you're there and you were a contributor, please turn on your camera. We'd love to say thank you to you as well. It's been such a fascinating sense of conversation. And just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we go. We're going to turn off the recording in a moment. Don't forget you have that code. Of course, it's new 30 or paper 30 used through the EUP bookshop if you wish to purchase a copy of 21st Century Gothic. Of course you do, is the answer. So please do get your hands on that. I also really want to thank my colleagues here at the Horror SIG. Thank you very much to Laura, to Shelley and to Kate for continuing to do fantastic horror associated events for BAFTSS. And of course, I want to encourage you to join BAFTSS, a fantastic organization, if I do say so myself. And please do, I'll put the information in the chat, but please do consider joining us for all of your film, television, and screen studies needs. Thank you, everyone. That's been a fantastic event. And thanks to our panelists and, as I say, our editors. So thank you. Yay.